The void of space stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the distant pinpricks of ancient stars and the churning chaos of battle. Admiral Catherine Cole stood on the bridge of the USS Defiant, her hands clasped behind her back as she watched the tactical display paint a picture of absolute devastation. The collective fleet, numbering over 3,000 vessels, had descended upon the Allied forces with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel and the brutality of a sledgehammer. The Alliance had gathered everything they had. The Velthari had brought their crystal ships, elegant vessels that bent light around themselves like cloaks woven from starlight. The Coraxian warfleets had arrived in force, their biomechanical dreadnoughts pulsing with the rhythm of living hearts. The Sindari had contributed their sleek interceptors, machines of pure speed built by a race that had been sailing the cosmic winds for 10,000 years. Even the reclusive Then had emerged from their nebular sanctuaries, their ancient battlecruisers humming with technologies older than human civilization itself. None of it had been enough. Catherine watched as another Velthari cruiser shattered under the collective's barrage, its crystalline hull fragmenting into a billion glittering shards that caught the light of nearby stars before fading into darkness. The communications channels were a cacophony of desperate voices, shouted orders in a dozen languages, prayers to gods whose names humanity had never learned, and the terrible silence that followed when ships stopped broadcasting altogether. "Admiral," Lieutenant Daniel Pierce said from his station, his voice tight with controlled fear, "the Coraxian flagship is requesting immediate support. They've lost propulsion and their shields are failing." Catherine didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the tactical display, watching the red icons of collective ships swarm through the Allied formation like wolves through a flock of sheep. The collective didn't negotiate. They didn't demand surrender. They simply consumed, absorbing everything they encountered into their vast networked consciousness. Species that had taken millions of years to evolve, cultures that had produced art and philosophy and dreams, all reduced to raw materials for the collective's endless expansion. "How many ships do we have left?" she asked. Commander Lisa Grant, her executive officer, pulled up the figures. Her face was pale beneath the harsh bridge lighting, shadows pooling in the hollows beneath her eyes. They had all been awake for 36 hours now, running on stimulants and desperation. Allied forces are down to approximately 800 combat-capable vessels. The collective has lost maybe 200. They're regenerating faster than we can destroy them. 800 ships against nearly 3,000. Catherine had studied military history extensively during her years at the academy. She knew the mathematics of defeat. She knew that sometimes, no matter how brave the soldiers or how righteous the cause, the numbers simply didn't work out. But she also knew something else, something that the other species in the Alliance had never quite understood about humanity. "Signal the fleet," she said quietly. "All human vessels are to form up on the Defiant. We're moving to the center of the formation." Pierce looked up from his console, confusion evident on his young face. "Admiral, the center is the most heavily contested zone. The collective has concentrated their main battle group there." "I know." Catherine turned to face her crew. The bridge of the Defiant was staffed by 43 men and women, each one hand-picked from the finest officers in the United Earth Navy. They had served together for 7 years, through skirmishes and peacekeeping missions and the long, cold watches between the stars. She knew their faces as well as she knew her own. She knew their hopes and fears, their families waiting back on Earth and the colonies, their dreams of a galaxy at peace. "What I'm about to ask you to do," she said, "is not something I ask lightly. We are about to engage the main collective force directly. Our allies are breaking. If we don't turn this battle around in the next hour, there won't be an alliance left to save. There won't be anyone left to stop the collective from rolling through every inhabited system in this sector." She paused, letting her words settle over the bridge like a funeral shroud. "I won't order you to follow me. Anyone who wants to transfer to another vessel or to fall back with the retreat groups may do so without judgment or consequence. But I intend to take this ship into the heart of that fleet and show the collective something they've never seen before. I intend to show them what humans are capable of when we have nothing left to lose." The bridge was silent. Then, one by one, her officers began to speak. "I'm with you, Admiral," Grant said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Weapons standing by," Chief Petty Officer Marcus Young reported from the tactical station. "I've been waiting to test out our new toys on something worthwhile." "Navigation locked in," Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells added. "Course plotted for the center of their formation. It's going to be a bumpy ride." One by one, every officer on the bridge voiced their commitment, not because they were ordered to, not because they expected to survive, but because they were human, and humans had been facing impossible odds since they first climbed down from the trees and looked up at the stars. Catherine felt something warm kindle in her chest, pride perhaps, or maybe just love for the brave souls who had chosen to stand beside her at the end of all things. "Then let's get to work," she said. "Pierce, open a channel to all human vessels." The lieutenant's fingers danced across his console. "Channel open, Admiral. You're broadcasting to all 47 remaining human warships." 47 ships, a tiny fraction of the Allied fleet. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 2 centuries, a mere heartbeat in cosmic terms. Their technology was considered primitive by most standards, their ships slower and less maneuverable than those of the elder races. The Velthari had been sailing between stars when humans were still building pyramids. The Then had been ancient when the first single-celled organisms appeared in Earth's primordial oceans. But humanity had one thing that none of the other species possessed. Something that couldn't be measured in terajoules or light years or processing power. Something that the collective, for all their networked intelligence, had never been able to understand. "This is Admiral Cole to all human vessels," Catherine said, her voice carrying across the void to ships named after heroes and dreams and the places they'd left behind. The Lincoln, the Armstrong, the New Hope, the Perseverance. Names that meant nothing to the aliens they fought beside, but everything to the men and women who crewed them. "I know you're tired. I know you're scared. I know that the tactical situation looks hopeless. Our allies are retreating. The collective is advancing. By any reasonable calculation, this battle is already lost." She paused, watching the battle rage on the display before her. Another Sindari interceptor wing vanished from the tactical plot, their ships torn apart by collective weapons that turned matter itself into energy. But humans have never been very good at reasonable calculations. We looked at the ocean and built boats. We looked at the sky and built wings. We looked at the stars and said, "Why not?" when every other species was saying, "Impossible." We are the descendants of people who crossed continents on foot, who sailed wooden ships into unknown waters, who strapped themselves to rockets fueled by hope and mathematics and sheer stubborn refusal to accept limitations. The collective thinks they know what we are. They've analyzed our ships. They've studied our tactics. They've calculated exactly how much force is required to destroy us. But they've missed something fundamental. They don't know what we're willing to sacrifice. They don't understand that for humans there are things worth more than survival: freedom, honor, the chance to stand between darkness and the people we love. I'm not going to lie to you. What I'm asking you to do will probably kill most of us, maybe all of us, but if we don't do it, everyone dies anyway. Our families, our friends, every human colony, every allied world, every species that ever dared to dream of something better. So I'm asking you to follow me one more time, into the fire, into the darkness, into the heart of an enemy that has never known defeat, and I'm asking you to show them what humanity really is. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering her father's face. He'd been a fisherman on the coast of Maine, a simple man who'd never traveled farther than Boston, but he'd taught her something that had stayed with her through every battle, every crisis, every dark night of the soul. "The sea doesn't care if you're afraid," he'd told her once when she was small. "Doesn't care if you're tired or hungry or cold. The only thing that matters is what you do. You either give up and drown or you keep swimming until you reach the shore." "All ships," Catherine said, opening her eyes, "form up on the Defiant. We're going swimming." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across the void, 46 warships broke from their defensive positions and began converging on the Defiant's location. Their captains didn't ask for clarification. They didn't question the order. They simply acknowledged and complied because they were human, and humans took care of their own. On the bridge of the USS Lincoln, Captain George Harris listened to Admiral Cole's speech with tears streaming down his weathered face. He had served 30 years in the Navy, had seen combat in half a dozen systems, had buried friends and mourned losses that still haunted his dreams. But he had never heard anything like this. He had never felt so certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be. "All hands," he announced over the ship's intercom. "This is the captain. You heard Admiral Cole. We're about to do something that military historians will either call brilliant or insane. Personally, I'm betting on brilliant, but either way, it's going to be one hell of a story." He paused, looking around at his bridge crew, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "I've served with you for 5 years. I know what you're capable of. Today, I'm asking you to give me everything you've got. Not because I order you to, but because I know you want to. Because this is why we signed up. This is the moment we've been training for our whole lives." Similar scenes played out across the human fleet. On every ship, captains spoke to their crews. Engineers ran final checks on systems they had already checked a dozen times. Weapons officers loaded their last missiles with hands that trembled not from fear but from anticipation. Medical staff prepared for casualties they knew they would never have time to treat. And in the quiet moments between preparations, crew members sent final messages home. Some were formal, carefully worded letters to be delivered in the event of their deaths. Others were simple recordings. A father telling his daughter he loved her, a wife reminding her husband to feed the cat, a brother promising his sister that everything would be okay, even though they both knew it probably wouldn't be. The alien commanders watched in confusion as the human vessels abandoned their coordinated positions. Admiral Vexthril of the Velthari High Fleet opened a direct channel to Catherine, his crystalline features flickering with distress patterns that her translator rendered as extreme concern. "Admiral Cole, what is the meaning of this? Your ships are leaving their assigned sectors. You're disrupting the defensive formation." "With respect, Admiral Vexthril, the defensive formation isn't working. We're losing." "Yes, but the alternative is chaos. If we maintain formation, we can conduct an orderly retreat, save as many ships as possible, regroup and watch them follow us to the next system, and the next, until there's nowhere left to run." Catherine shook her head. "I've read the intelligence reports. The collective doesn't stop. They've consumed 47 civilizations across 3 galaxies. No one has ever successfully retreated from them because there's nowhere to retreat to." "Then what do you propose?" "Something they won't expect, something no one has ever tried." Catherine smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had made peace with death. "We're going to attack." The Velthari admiral's patterns shifted through several colors Catherine didn't recognize. Confusion, perhaps, or disbelief. "Attack, Admiral, you have 47 ships. They have nearly 3,000. The mathematical probability of success is irrelevant." Catherine cut him off. "The mathematics only matter if you're planning to survive. We're not planning to survive, Admiral. We're planning to win. There's a difference." She terminated the connection before he could respond. There wasn't time for debate, and nothing he could say would change her mind. The human fleet was forming up around the Defiant now, their ships arranging themselves into a formation that hadn't been used in human warfare for centuries. The wedge. The formation of cavalry charges and desperate last stands. The formation that said, "We're coming straight at you, and we don't care what's in our way." "All ships, this is the Defiant," Catherine broadcast. "Prepare for close quarters engagement. Maximum acceleration on my mark. Target the collective command nexus at the center of their formation." "Admiral," Grant said quietly, "the command nexus is surrounded by at least 200 combat vessels. Even if we break through the outer perimeter, we'll be torn apart before we can get close." "I know. That's why we're not going to slow down." Catherine pulled up the tactical overlay and highlighted a specific point in the enemy formation. "The collective ships are networked. They share processing power, sensor data, tactical calculations. It makes them incredibly efficient, but it also creates a vulnerability. Destroy the command nexus and every ship within range loses coordination. They'll still be dangerous, but they'll be fighting as individuals, not as a unified force." "How do you know that will work?" Grant asked. Catherine smiled grimly. "I don't, But it's the only shot we've got. The human fleet finished its formation. 47 warships, their hulls scarred from the battle, their crews exhausted but determined. At the point of the wedge sat the Defiant, her engines glowing with barely restrained power. "All hands," Catherine announced over the shipwide intercom. "This is the Admiral. In a few minutes, we're going to do something incredibly stupid and incredibly brave. I want you all to know that it has been the honor of my life to serve with you. Whatever happens next, know that your sacrifice will not be forgotten. The people we leave behind will remember what we did here today. They'll tell stories about us. They'll name ships after us. And someday, when humanity reaches the stars they haven't even discovered yet, they'll look back at this moment and know that this is where the tide turned." She paused, her throat tight with emotion. "Now let's go show these things what they're really up against. All ships mark, execute." The human fleet surged forward. Across the battlefield, the reaction was immediate and varied. The collective detected the movement and began repositioning their vessels to intercept. The Allied commanders watched in stunned disbelief as the tiny human force accelerated directly toward the heart of the enemy formation. Admiral Vexthril tried to contact Catherine again, but she had disabled incoming communications. There was nothing left to say. The first collective ships opened fire when the humans were still 50,000 kilometers out. Energy beams and missile swarms filled the void between the fleets, a wall of destruction that should have annihilated anything in its path. On the bridge of the New Hope, Ensign Timothy Baker watched the incoming fire on his sensor display with something approaching detachment. He was 22 years old, fresh out of the academy on his first deployment. 3 months ago, his biggest worry had been whether he would pass his navigation certification exam. Now he was plotting a course through a killing field that no simulation had ever prepared him for. "Evasive pattern Delta," Captain Maria Santos ordered from her command chair. "All hands, brace for impact." Timothy's fingers moved across his console with a precision he didn't know he possessed. The ship rolled and pitched, dancing between energy beams that would have vaporized them in an instant. He could feel the hull groaning around him, protesting the impossible maneuvers he was asking of it. "Good flying, Ensign," Santos said quietly. "Keep it up." Timothy didn't respond. He couldn't. All of his concentration was focused on the dance of survival, threading the New Hope through gaps that closed almost as soon as they opened. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that luck was a bigger factor than skill in whether they lived or died. But he kept flying anyway because that was all he could do. But the human ships didn't fly like other ships. The collective had studied human technology. They knew the theoretical capabilities of Earth-built warships. What they hadn't accounted for was the human willingness to push those capabilities far beyond their design limits. Human pilots ran their engines at 120%, accepting the risk of catastrophic failure for a few extra kilometers per second of speed. Human gunners fired their weapons in patterns that the collective's tactical computers classified as random, but were actually the product of intuition and instinct, the accumulated combat experience of a species that had been fighting wars since before they could write. The USS Lincoln took a direct hit to her port side and kept coming, her crew sealing off the damaged sections with their own bodies to keep the atmosphere from venting. The New Hope lost her main sensors and continued the attack, navigating by nothing but the data shared from her sister ships and the star patterns burned into her navigator's memory. The Perseverance, her captain dead and her bridge a ruin, was still in formation, controlled by a junior lieutenant who had never commanded anything larger than a shuttle. They were dying. Oh God, they were dying. Catherine watched the tactical display as ship after ship winked out of existence, their icons replaced by the expanding clouds of debris that were all that remained of crews who had trusted her judgment. But they weren't stopping. They weren't even slowing down. The collective had never seen anything like it. Their tactical algorithms were based on billions of combat engagements across thousands of years. They understood aggression and defense, advance and retreat, sacrifice and self-preservation. What they didn't understand was madness. What they couldn't calculate was the behavior of beings who had decided that death was preferable to defeat. The human wedge punched through the outer perimeter of the collective formation like a fist through paper. Ships that should have been destroyed kept fighting, their crews performing repairs under fire, rerouting power from non-essential systems, sealing breaches with emergency foam and raw determination. The collective ships tried to pursue, but the humans weren't interested in dogfighting. They were interested in one thing only, the command nexus at the center of the fleet. 20,000 kilometers to target, Grant reported, her voice raw. The bridge had taken a hit during the initial assault and she was bleeding from a gash on her forehead. She hadn't bothered to treat it. We've lost the Armstrong, the Liberty, and the Spirit of Chicago. 23 ships remaining. 23 ships. Half their force gone in minutes, and they still had 20,000 kilometers to go. Maintain course, Catherine ordered. All ships, divert power from life support to weapons and shields. We won't need the air much longer anyway. It was a horrific order. It meant that every crew member would be breathing their last reserves of oxygen, that the cold of space would begin seeping into the ships even as they fought. It meant that even if they survived the battle, many would suffocate or freeze before rescue could arrive. Not a single captain protested. Not a single crew member hesitated. The collective noticed the power spike in the human vessels. Their tactical systems classified it as a desperation measure, the last gasp of a defeated enemy. They increased their fire, concentrating on the lead ships of the formation, trying to break the point of the wedge before it could reach the nexus. The Defiant shuddered as energy beams raked across her hull. Warning alarms screamed through the bridge, mixing with the reports of damage from every section of the ship. The forward torpedo bay was gone. Deck 7 was on fire. The secondary reactor was offline. A dozen crewmen were dead or dying in the corridors, but the ship was still moving, still fighting, still closing the distance. 10,000 kilometers, Grant gasped. She had slumped against her console, her face gray with blood loss. Someone had wrapped a bandage around her head, but it was already soaked through. 15 ships remaining. Catherine didn't respond. She was focused entirely on the tactical display, watching the command nexus grow larger in the center of her screen. It was a massive structure, easily 10 times the size of the Defiant, bristling with weapons and sensor arrays. The neural core of the collective fleet, the seat of their networked intelligence. Destroy it, and the enemy would be crippled. Fail, and everything they'd sacrificed would be for nothing. 5,000 kilometers. The collective had realized the danger. Ships were converging on the nexus from every direction, forming a defensive barrier that seemed impenetrable. Catherine counted at least 50 vessels between her and the target, their weapons charging for a final devastating volley. "Young," she said calmly, "arm all remaining warheads. Set them for proximity detonation at 200 meters. The tactical officer looked at her with wide eyes. "Admiral, that's inside our own blast radius. We'll be caught in the explosion." "I know." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "Do it." Young's hands moved across his console. "Warheads armed, ready to fire on your command." "All ships," Catherine broadcast. "This is the Defiant. Fire everything you've got at the nexus. Don't worry about accuracy. Don't worry about conservation. Just fire." The response was a storm of weapons fire that lit up the void like a second sun. Every torpedo, every missile, every energy beam the human fleet could muster converged on the collective command nexus. The defensive ships tried to intercept, their point defense systems working overtime, but there was simply too much incoming fire. The first explosions tore holes in the nexus's outer hull. The second wave breached the inner compartments. The third reached the neural core itself, the delicate quantum processors that coordinated the actions of 3,000 ships. And then the Defiant arrived. Catherine Cole, in the final seconds of her life, had time for one last thought. She thought of Earth. She thought of blue oceans and green forests and the sound of rain on a tin roof. She thought of her father, long dead now, and the lessons he'd taught her about the sea. She thought of the crew she was about to die with, brave men and women who had followed her into hell without hesitation. And she thought, "We did it. We actually did it." The Defiant struck the command nexus at full speed, her hull already crumbling from the damage she'd taken. The warheads detonated on impact, their combined force magnified by the volatile materials inside the nexus itself. The resulting explosion was visible across the entire battlefield, a brilliant white flash that momentarily outshone the nearby star. And then there was silence. Not the silence of victory, not yet, but the silence of confusion. The silence of a vast networked intelligence suddenly severed from itself. Across the battlefield, collective ships stopped firing. Their coordinated movements dissolved into chaos as each vessel's limited onboard intelligence tried to process what had happened. Some ships continued their attacks, but without direction, without coordination. Others simply stopped, their systems overwhelmed by the sudden loss of network connectivity. Admiral Vexthril stared at his display in disbelief. The human fleet was gone. 47 ships, nearly 8,000 souls, reduced to expanding clouds of debris around the shattered remains of the collective command nexus. It was the most devastating loss any single species had suffered in the entire war. But the collective was reeling. Their ships were firing on each other in confusion. Their formation had collapsed. Their seemingly invincible advance had ground to a halt. "All ships," Vexthril said slowly, his crystalline voice trembling with something that might have been awe, "advance. Press the attack." The Allied fleet surged forward, seizing the opportunity the humans had bought with their lives. The Velthari crystal ships wove through the disorganized collective formations, their weapons striking with precision against enemies that could no longer coordinate their defenses. The Coraxian dreadnoughts, freed from the relentless pressure of coordinated attack, began to recover and push back. The Sindari interceptors darted through the chaos, picking off isolated targets. Even the ancient Then battlecruisers joined the assault, their weapons humming with power that predated human civilization. What followed was not a battle, it was a rout. The collective, without their networked coordination, fought as individuals for the first time in their existence, and as individuals they were utterly outmatched. They had no experience with independent decision-making, no instinct for self-preservation separate from the whole. One by one, their ships were destroyed or disabled, their crews either killed or captured. By the time the battle ended, more than 2,000 collective vessels had been destroyed. The remainder had retreated into deep space, their network shattered, their threat neutralized for generations to come. The Allied fleet had lost heavily too, nearly half their forces, but they had survived. They had won. And at the heart of the victory, in the debris field that marked the final resting place of the human fleet, there was silence. In the days that followed, the Allied commanders gathered to assess the battle and plan for the future. The mood was somber despite the victory. The humans had given everything they had, and in return the galaxy had been saved. It seemed an unfair exchange. Admiral Vexthril stood before the assembled commanders, his crystalline form projecting the colors of deep mourning. "I have studied military history for 3,000 years," he said. "I have seen courage in many forms from many species, but I have never seen anything like what the humans did today. They knew they would die. They knew their sacrifice might not even work. And they did it anyway." The Coraxian fleet commander, a massive being of muscle and metal, rumbled his agreement. "We called them primitive. We looked down on their technology, their short lifespans, their irrational emotions. We were wrong. They are not primitive. They are simply different, and that difference saved us all." The Sindari representative, her sleek form shimmering with barely contained speed, spoke next. "My people value efficiency above all things. We calculate the optimal outcome and pursue it without deviation. The humans did the opposite. They pursued an impossible outcome and made it real through sheer force of will. It should not have worked. It defies everything we understand about warfare." "Perhaps," the ancient Then observer said, his voice like distant thunder, "that is why it did work. The collective had calculated every possible scenario, accounted for every rational response. They had no defense against irrationality. No counter to beings who would choose certain death over certain defeat." Vexthril nodded slowly. "I tried to contact Admiral Cole before the final assault. I wanted to tell her that what she was doing was madness, that the mathematics didn't support her strategy, that she was throwing away her fleet for nothing." He paused, his colors shifting to something complex and painful. "I was wrong. She knew the mathematics better than I did. She simply refused to accept them as constraints." The gathering fell silent, each commander lost in thought. Finally, the Coraxian spoke again. "We must honor them, not with empty words or ceremonial gestures, but with something real, something lasting." "Agreed," Vexrel said. "I propose that the site of the battle be declared a memorial zone. No ship shall traverse it without paying respects. No species shall forget what happened here." "And what of humanity itself?" the Sindari asked. "They have lost nearly their entire fleet. Their military is devastated. They will be vulnerable for decades." "Then we will protect them," the Then observer said firmly. "As they protected us. The Alliance will guarantee their security until they have rebuilt their forces. It is the least we can do." The other commanders voiced their agreement. In a single battle, humanity had transformed from the weakest member of the Alliance to its most respected. Not through technological superiority or numerical advantage, but through something far more rare and precious: the willingness to sacrifice everything for what they believed in. On Earth, the news of the battle arrived like a thunderclap. The initial reports spoke only of devastating losses, and for hours the planet mourned. Every human who had ever looked up at the stars and wondered if their children would be safe wept for the brave souls who had given their lives so far from home. But then the full story emerged. The sacrifice had not been in vain, the enemy had been defeated, the galaxy had been saved, and humanity, for all its youth and inexperience, had proven itself worthy of standing among the stars. The mourning continued, but it was joined by something else: pride, determination, a renewed commitment to the future that Catherine Cole and her crews had died to protect. In the shipyards of Earth and Mars and Luna and the orbital platforms scattered throughout the solar system, construction began on a new generation of warships. They would be named for the vessels lost at the battle: the Cole, the Grant, the Young, the Wells. Names that would be remembered for as long as humans sailed between the stars. And in every military academy, every training facility, every ship that launched from human ports, a new tradition was born. Before each mission, before each voyage into the unknown, crews would gather and recite the words that Admiral Catherine Cole had spoken in her final transmission. "We're going swimming." A simple phrase, an echo of a fisherman's wisdom passed down through generations. A reminder that the universe didn't care about their fears or their doubts or their calculations of probability. The only thing that mattered was what they did: either give up and drown or keep swimming until you reach the shore. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, as rescue ships combed through the debris field looking for survivors, a miracle occurred. The emergency beacon of the USS Perseverance began broadcasting, weak and intermittent, but undeniably alive. Search teams converged on the signal and found the ship's command module, battered beyond recognition, but somehow intact. Inside, they discovered 17 survivors, including Lieutenant Rebecca Morris, the young officer who had taken command when the bridge was destroyed. Rebecca was barely conscious when they pulled her from the wreckage. Her body was broken in a dozen places, her skin mottled with radiation burns, her lungs struggling to process the thin air of the emergency reserves. But she was alive. She had kept her crew alive through the final minutes of the assault, sealing them in the most heavily shielded section of the ship and riding out the apocalyptic forces that had destroyed everything else. "Admiral Cole," she whispered as the medics worked to stabilize her. Did we get the Nexus?" The Velthari rescue commander, who had been overseeing the extraction, paused in his work. His crystalline features shifted through colors that Rebecca's exhausted mind couldn't interpret. "You destroyed it," he said, his voice translated through the medical bay systems. Admiral Cole led the final strike herself. The Defiant impacted the Nexus directly. There was nothing left. Rebecca closed her eyes. Tears streaked down her damaged face, cutting clean paths through the soot and blood. "She did it. She actually did it." "You all did it," the Velthari said. "Every ship, every crew member. What you accomplished here today will be remembered for as long as there are beings to remember it." Rebecca wanted to respond, but consciousness was slipping away from her, pulled under by the drugs the medics were pumping into her system. Her last thought before the darkness took her was of Admiral Cole's voice, calm and steady over the fleet communications. saying those simple words that had become their battle cry. "We're going swimming." The 17 survivors of the Perseverance became instant celebrities upon their return to Earth. They were paraded before governments and media outlets, asked to recount their experiences 1,000 times, held up as living symbols of human courage and resilience. Rebecca Morris, now promoted to commander and decorated with every honor the United Earth Navy could bestow, found herself uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't do anything special," she told an interviewer during one of her mandatory media appearances. "I just did what any of us would have done." What every person on every ship that day did. We followed Admiral Cole because we believed in her, because we believed in what we were fighting for. "But you survived," the interviewer pressed. "Out of nearly 8,000 people, you and 16 others are the only ones who made it. Doesn't that feel significant?" Rebecca's expression darkened. "It feels like a burden. Every day I wake up and I think about the people who didn't. I think about the families who will never see their loved ones again. I think about all the dreams and hopes and futures that ended in that debris field." She paused, composing herself. "I survived by accident, by the random chance of where I happened to be standing when the ship broke apart. That's not heroism, that's just luck. Some would say it's providence. Some would say a lot of things." Rebecca shook her head. "All I know is that I'm still here and they're not, and I have a responsibility to honor what they did. Not by giving interviews or accepting medals, but by continuing to serve. By being the kind of officer that Admiral Cole would have been proud of." She requested a return to active duty as soon as she was medically cleared, and the Navy granted her command of the USS Cole, the first ship of the new generation to bear a name from the battle. It was a posting of immense symbolic importance, and Rebecca approached it with the same quiet determination that had kept her alive in the wreckage of the Perseverance. Her first voyage was to the Memorial Zone, where she and her crew held a ceremony to honor the fallen. Standing on the bridge that bore Catherine Cole's name, looking out at the stars that had witnessed humanity's finest hour, Rebecca felt something she hadn't felt since the battle: peace. "This is Commander Morris of the USS Cole," she broadcast on the open frequency used by ships passing through the memorial. "We are here to remember, we are here to honor, and we are here to continue the mission that our predecessors began." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "To Admiral Cole and all who served with her, your sacrifice was not in vain. The galaxy you died to protect is thriving. The darkness you fought against has been driven back. And humanity stands among the stars, stronger and more united than ever before." She took a deep breath, steadying herself for the final words. "We're still swimming, and we always will be. Cole out." The broadcast was picked up by ships across the sector, human and alien alike. It was rebroadcast on news networks throughout the Alliance, translated into hundreds of languages, studied by military academies and civilian scholars. In the years that followed, it became tradition for every captain passing through the memorial to make a similar broadcast, adding their voice to the chorus of remembrance that echoed through the void. The collective never recovered. Their networked civilization, dependent on centralized coordination, fractured into thousands of isolated groups. Some eventually sought peace with the Alliance, recognizing that their dreams of universal assimilation were impossible as long as humanity stood against them. Others retreated into the dark spaces between galaxies, nursing their wounds and their grudges. But they never again posed a threat to the civilized galaxy. The memory of what had happened when they pushed humanity too far was seared into their collective consciousness, a lesson they would not forget. There were some enemies that couldn't be defeated through superior numbers or advanced technology. There were some enemies that would keep fighting long after any reasonable calculation said they should surrender. Humanity was such an enemy, and the collective had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Centuries passed. The Alliance grew and prospered, welcoming new species and expanding to new territories. Humanity grew with it, no longer the newcomers but full partners in the galactic community. They brought their music and their art and their stubborn optimism to every corner of the known universe, spreading the belief that anything was possible if you were willing to work for it. And always at the heart of human space, there remained a memorial, a vast region of emptiness where no ship traveled without permission, marked by beacons that broadcast a single message in every language known to sentient life. Here, in the year 2387 of the human calendar, 47 warships of the United Earth Navy gave their lives to save the galaxy. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. They were fighting against impossible odds. And they won anyway, because they refused to accept that some things were impossible. Remember them. Honor them. And if you ever face darkness that seems unconquerable, remember what they taught us all, that the greatest power in the universe is not in weapons or technology, but in the hearts of beings who will never stop fighting for what they believe in. Ships passing through the region would slow to a crawl, their crews gathering at viewports to look out at the stars that now bore human names. They would raise their glasses or their appendages or their energy fields in salute, honoring the men and women who had died so far from home to protect people they would never meet. And somewhere, in whatever realm awaits those who give their lives for others, Catherine Cole smiled. She had never wanted to be a hero. She had never sought glory or recognition. All she had wanted was to keep swimming, to keep fighting, to keep pushing forward until she reached the shore. She had done that and more. She had shown the galaxy what humanity was capable of. She had proven that the measure of a species was not in their technology or their lifespans or their mathematical calculations, but in their willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it cost them everything. The human warship had entered the battle, and silence had fallen. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a universe holding its breath in awe of what it had witnessed. And in that silence, humanity had claimed victory, not just over the collective, but over the doubt that had whispered they were too young, too weak, too insignificant to matter. They mattered now. They would always matter, and the stars themselves would remember their names. Years later, a young cadet named Samuel Brooks stood at the observation deck of the Memorial Station, his uniform crisp and new, his eyes fixed on the vast emptiness beyond the viewport. He had grown up hearing stories of the battle, of Admiral Cole and her impossible victory, of the 47 ships that had changed the course of galactic history. Now, finally, he was here to see it for himself. "First time?" asked a voice beside him. Samuel turned to find an elderly woman in the uniform of a retired commander, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her eyes carrying the weight of decades of service. A row of medals adorned her chest, but the one that caught his attention was a small silver pin shaped like a ship's anchor, the symbol of those who had served in the fleet before the battle. "Yes, ma'am," he replied. "I wanted to see it before my first deployment." The woman nodded, her gaze drifting back to the stars. "I come here every year on the anniversary. My brother served on the Lincoln, chief engineer. He was 26 years old." Samuel swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." The woman's voice was firm but kind. He knew what he was doing. They all did. That's what made it meaningful. She turned to look at him directly, her eyes searching his face. "Do you understand that, cadet? The sacrifice only matters because it was chosen freely, because every person on those ships could have retreated, could have run, and instead they chose to stand and fight." "I think so," Samuel said slowly. "At least, I hope I understand. I hope that when my time comes, I'll be able to make the same choice." The woman smiled, and for a moment she looked almost young again. "You will. That's the thing about humans, you know. We always think we're not brave enough, not strong enough, not good enough. And then the moment comes and we find out what we're really made of." She reached out and placed a weathered hand on his shoulder. "Your generation will face its own challenges, its own impossible odds. And when you do, you'll remember what happened here. You'll remember that impossible is just a word and words can be overcome." Samuel stood a little straighter. "Thank you, Commander." "Margaret," she said. "Call me Margaret, and good luck, cadet. The galaxy needs people like you. People who still believe that one person, one ship, one moment of courage can change everything." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the quiet of the observation deck. Samuel watched her go, then turned back to the viewport. Out there, somewhere in that vast emptiness, the atoms that had once been human warships still drifted among the stars. They had become part of the cosmos itself, scattered across light years, merged with nebulae and drawn into the gravity wells of newborn suns. It seemed fitting somehow. The crews of those ships had given themselves to protect the future, and now they were literally becoming part of it. Their sacrifice had seeded the universe with human spirit, an eternal reminder that there were things worth dying for. Samuel raised his hand in a slow salute, holding it until his arm began to ache. Then he lowered it, squared his shoulders, and walked away from the viewport. His ship was waiting. His crew was waiting. The future was waiting, and he was ready to swim. Decades after the battle, the Alliance established the Cole Academy, a joint military institution where cadets from every member species trained together. The curriculum emphasized not just tactics and technology, but the qualities that had made the human sacrifice possible: courage, determination, and the willingness to put the needs of others above personal survival. Velthari students struggled with the concepts at first. Their crystalline minds were optimized for logical analysis and probability calculation. The idea of deliberately choosing a course of action with a near-zero chance of success seemed irrational, almost pathological. But slowly, through study and discussion, and the patient guidance of human instructors, they began to understand. It is not about the probability of success, one Velthari graduate explained to a journalist years later. It is about the certainty of failure if no action is taken. When retreat means eventual extinction, even a 1% chance of victory becomes infinitely preferable to the 0% chance of survival through surrender. The Coraxians found the human approach more intuitive. Their warrior culture already valued courage and sacrifice, though they had always channeled it through ritualized combat and carefully calculated risk. The idea of throwing everything away on a desperate gamble was new to them, but it resonated with something deep in their collective memory, some ancient instinct from before they became a spacefaring civilization. Humans fight like cornered predators, a Coraxian fleet commander observed during a joint training exercise. They become most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. Other species see this as a weakness, a sign of poor planning, but it is actually their greatest strength. An enemy who knows they cannot predict your response is an enemy who can never feel truly secure. The Sindari, with their emphasis on speed and efficiency, developed a new tactical doctrine that incorporated human-style unpredictability into their operations. They called it the Cole Maneuver, and it involved deliberately making suboptimal choices in order to confuse enemy tactical computers. The doctrine proved devastatingly effective against automated defense systems, which struggled to respond to behavior that didn't follow logical patterns. Even the ancient Then, who had watched civilizations rise and fall for millions of years, acknowledged that they had learned something new from humanity. Their philosophers spent decades analyzing the battle, trying to understand how such a young species had accomplished what seemed impossible. The conclusion they reached was both humbling and inspiring. Age and wisdom were not the only paths to greatness. Sometimes, a species could achieve more through passion and determination than another could accomplish with millennia of accumulated knowledge. On the anniversary of the battle, ships from every allied species would gather at the memorial zone. They would form a vast fleet, not for war but for remembrance, their hulls gleaming in the light of distant stars. And as the moment of the final assault approached, they would fall silent, every voice stilled, every system hushed, until the only sound was the soft pulse of life support and the distant hum of engines. In that silence, they remembered. They remembered the 47 ships that had charged into certain death. They remembered the nearly 8,000 souls who had given everything so that others might live. They remembered Admiral Catherine Cole, the fisherman's daughter who had become a legend, and all the men and women who had followed her into the fire. And in that silence, they made a promise to honor the sacrifice, a promise to protect what had been won, a promise to never forget that the greatest victories are often achieved by those who refuse to accept that they have already lost. For in the end, that was the true legacy of the battle, not the destruction of the collective command nexus, not the turning of the tide against an unstoppable enemy, not even the salvation of countless worlds and species. The true legacy was the lesson that humanity had taught the galaxy, that there is no such thing as impossible, only difficult. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important, that the measure of a civilization is not in what it builds or conquers, but in what it is willing to sacrifice to protect what it loves. The human warship had entered the battle, and silence had fallen. But in that silence, a new song had begun. A song of hope and courage and the indomitable spirit of beings who would never stop fighting for the future they believed in. It was a song that would echo through the ages, inspiring generations yet unborn, reaching across the vast distances of space and time to touch the hearts of all who heard it. And humanity, once the youngest and weakest member of the galactic community, had claimed its place among the stars, not through conquest or technological superiority, but through the simple, profound act of being willing to give everything for what they believed was right. They had gone swimming, and they had reached the shore, the end.